co-spirituality class went out to Merton's Hermitage to meet Brother Paul the other morning. And as soon as he walked us out there, we gathered in the Hermitage, and he didn't say anything for about 15 minutes. And we just sat, and you know, some of the students were fidgeting and all that, but just kept silent right through it. And then towards the end, everyone just dropped, settled down. So it was beautiful. But to take silence seriously, you know, seems to be an aspect of honoring life in a serious way. Camille and Kabir are kind of a dynamic duo in bringing Sufism to the West. And I would say also living anecdotes to some of the negative stereotypes of Islam that still exist in some places in the West. I'll read a little bit of their bios, but if you want the full information, very easy to remember, www.sufism.org. And that will plug you into all the work that they're doing, both in Louisville but also around the world. They get around, as you'll find out. So, Sheikha Camille Helminski has been working with the Mevlevi tradition of Sufism for over 35 years and has helped to increase awareness of the integral contribution of women to the spiritual path of Islam, especially through her book, Women in Sufism. She has co-translated many volumes of Sufi literature and is the first woman to translate a substantial volume of the Quran into English, The Light of Dawn, Selections from the Quran for Daily Contemplation. Sheikh Kabir Helminski was named one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world in 2009. He's the first Westerner to be officially recognized as a Shaikh of the Mevlevi order, dating back to Rumi. He has translated many volumes of Sufi literature, including many works of Rumi, and is the author of 2 books on Sufism, Living Presence and The Knowing Heart. This is the shortened version of the bio, because the bios could really go on and on. I see we've got music here today, and there's just a few of us gathered, but what does that mean? You know? Yeah, there's plenty of room for our spirits to move, for our spirits to dance, for our spirits to enter into communion with one another. And that's what this Sufi path is about. I would say as all authentic mystical traditions in the world are about getting beyond what separates us and celebrating that which unites us in reality, where it's something that we feel underneath the various cultures that shape us is a uniting power of spirit. So, in that vein, it's a pleasure to introduce Sheikha Camille and Sheikh Kabir Helminski.
So, can I ask you questions?
It's your stage, yeah, whatever.
Because that's what I'm going to do. Let's consider, what is spirituality? What do we understand by this word? Is it an interesting word? Is it an important word? And let's just put our heads together a little bit and just reflect. Why are we here? And how do we understand spirituality? Now, I realize I could be talking about my own tradition, and we will. We'll talk about Sufism and what it is. But just to begin and set a context, anybody who would like to try to offer a definition or an insight into what you understand by spirituality. Matthew, in a way, has given us a start by saying it has something to do with uniting human beings. Above and beyond are the things that separate us. What else could we say about this? Yes, sister.
Relationship with God and God's relationship with us.
Okay, now, what's God? Who's that? What is God, and how will I know that I have a relationship with it?
That's a good question. Go ahead.
It's the drive that causes us to look for something bigger than ourselves and the world around us.
Okay.
Be in contact with something more than us.
Beautiful. So it's, and I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. This is really an inquiry. I'm not here just to prove anything or just fill you with lots of content, but to ask some questions. So, and what's your name?
Anne.
Anne. So Anne said it's that drive in us to find something larger than ourselves. In other words, it's something innate in the human being that causes us to look for something. We may not know what it is, but we may be dissatisfied, or we may feel the limitations of ourselves. And so something in us is looking for something. How do we know anything is there to be found?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's my search for the mystery of God. You got it, because God, we don't know. So God, whatever that drawing is to this non-being, because God isn't a being, because then he'd be a human, and so whatever that mystery is of relationship with an almighty something or someone, and all that was created by that God.
Yeah.
Like that.
So you've brought the element of mystery
Yes.
into this. In other words, it's something that we don't. I'm just going to sort of give it back to you in a way, how I understand this. If I asked you what is a 2013 BMW, we could pretty much tell what a 2013 BMW is. But when it comes to this thing called God, there's an element of mystery, because we don't know it the way we know other things in this world. So this is interesting. And in a way, what I wanted to talk about today, what I thought would be useful, would be to, in these general terms at first, what do we know? How do we know it? What is our spiritual search is about? And what do we search with? So I think we could say that we have senses that allow us to perceive this physical world, and we have a brain that helps us to think about the things we perceive in this physical world. And then there seems to be something else that is kind of mysterious, and it's not even the same as our ordinary emotions. Our ordinary emotions are, I like this, I don't like that, or I'm afraid of this, or I'm happy about that. But we have something in our human experience that is a yearning, a longing for something to satisfy our hearts, for something that will bring us a sense of well-being and a sense of meaning. So, one beautiful definition of spirituality that was once shared with us, and see if this is meaningful to you. It is a search for the widest possible context for our lives. I think that describes our progress on the spiritual journey. I hope it does. An ever-widening context, an ever-widening sense of what reality is and the situation we find ourselves in. And an opening to what we could call spiritual perception, an opening to something in us that can feel, or sense might be a better word, a direct relationship with a spiritual reality. In other words, and I think this is something, even before we get to God, because I don't know if anybody here have you actually seen he, she, it? Or have we experienced something that has touched our hearts and brought us a deep sense of peace, well-being, maybe even of being loved? Is it possible to sense something like that and to have such experiences? And how do we deepen in those experiences? So this is a way of reflecting on not just the spiritual journey, but the human journey. And I think, especially for you students who are here, spirituality is really about what it means to be a human being and to develop what you are as a human being, but as a human being in relationship to something else, as also was said, our relationship with the mystery, with some sense of spiritual being. And that, why do we need this? Maybe we don't. Maybe some people don't. But this brings us to the question of the nature of the human self. Forgive me if this sounds a little abstract, but I think it's really extremely, extremely important. If you've lived, maybe even if you're young, you have seen how it's possible for people to be their own worst enemies, or for the ego of the human being to be our own worst enemies, how we sometimes can be self-destructive, egotistical, aggressive, selfish, and to get caught up in a part of ourselves that in hindsight we wish we hadn't, or get caught up in a part of ourselves that from another perspective we can see how useless it really is, and yet at the time we were so identified with our limited self, our ego, that we were justifying it, defending it, and living out of this small self, this, we could call it a lower self or false self. So this is another idea to introduce into the equation. Spirituality is seeking the widest possible context. Spirituality is seeking a relationship with some spiritual reality, call it God if you like. We have no problem with that. But then there's something else going on in our lives which is blocking us from that experience, that gets in the way, or that causes our souls and our attention to be absorbed in ourselves, but not even really our true selves, in our own egos, and to be cut off from this beautiful relationship with something unseen, with something that could, I believe it could be the most satisfying relationship that a human being will ever experience. A relationship with the divine, which, the more it becomes real for us, the more it transforms our relationships with each other, which also brings us back to what Matt said. The ability to recognize the unity of human beings. Now I'm going to ask Camille. Camille, you have a copy of the Pocket Rumi. sometimes we just open this book. It's a little collection of sayings of Rumi, which is the inspiration for our tradition. Rumi, Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, we call him, lived in the 13th century, mostly in what today would be Turkey, though he was born in what today would be called Afghanistan. And he is, in much of the world, well, he's probably the most popular spiritual poet in the world today, even after 7 centuries, and beloved in many cultures, including in North America. In our culture, he's referred to by people from all kinds of traditions. Buddhists love him, Hindus love him, Jews quote him, Christians study him, and of course he is from a Muslim context, and he was a faithful Muslim in his practice all through his life. But above all, he was a universal human being who was both a literary genius and a saint in his own right. He lived what he spoke. He didn't have literary ambitions. He didn't set out and say one day, I want to become the greatest spiritual author in history. No, it just flowed out of him. And so that's a little bit about Rumi, the sort of inspiration for our tradition. And since we sort of trust in synchronicity, we trust that, we're sort of crazy, We sort of think that everything that's happening in the moment has meaning, and as if some great intelligence has set all of this up for our own education. We're really that insane, we think things like this. So we we'll open up a book and say, well, what does Rumi have to say to us at this moment? Okay?
To clutch at madness. Conventional opinion is the ruin of our souls, something borrowed which we mistake as our own. Ignorance is better than this. Clutch at madness instead. Always run from what seems to benefit yourself. Sip the poison and spill the water of life. Revile those who flatter you. Lend both interest and principal to the poor. Let security go and be at home amid dangers. Leave your good name behind and accept disgrace. I have lived with cautious thinking. Now I'll make myself mad.
So let's just keep this here.
Yeah.
There are probably not more than 2 or 3 pages in this book that refer to madness in this way. You might think, well, maybe all the poems are about madness. No, they're not. This one is. So what is this madness that he's talking about? Is it really madness? He begins by saying, conventional opinion is the ruin of our souls. We live in a society where everybody has an opinion. You don't need facts to have opinions. It's a democracy. And Americans are prone to thinking, well, I have a right to my opinion. No matter how well or ill-informed we may be, people are loaded with opinions. And I don't know if you agree with me, but there's 2 kinds of madness. The kind of madness that Rumi is proposing here. And then there's the madness that surrounds us, the madness of war, the madness of economic injustice, the madness of environmental destruction. That's one kind of insanity. And then there's this other spiritual insanity that Rumi is talking about. This insanity only looks like insanity from the point of view of egoism, from point of view of a self-serving, selfish mentality. Lend interest and the capital to the poor, give it all away. Be at home amidst dangers. Don't strategize your whole life to be safe and secure, which is what most people are doing. Don't think that the purpose of life is to remain forever undisturbed, as if you could ever find that anyway. So he's proposing something here. I'm not sure that he actually identifies what he's proposing. And of course, these are just selections. These are not whole poems. Leave your good name behind and accept disgrace. How much do we allow ourselves to be tyrannized by other people's opinions of ourselves? And in that state, to lose our courage and our conscience, to go with the crowd, to go with the mob even. How much of our integrity do we sacrifice? Because we just want to sort of fit in with everybody else. So, yes, Camille.
This is on, right? Can you hear me?
You might have to turn it on.
Ah, there. Maybe that's better. This brings us to the phrase that was on the flyer that Matt printed of Rumi and the science of the heart, and the sense in which Rumi, by bringing up this notion of madness, is pointing us away from our intellectual formulations of things and opening that space of the heart, that place where we're cracked open, where our assumptions are dissolved, and we're opened again to that mystery that was spoken of. And in this understanding within the Sufi path, there is a sort of an unfolding of the development of the self and of the capacity of the heart that is spoken of with 7 levels of the self. So that the first level of the self is that commanding self that thinks it has all the answers and that pushes us in directions that conform to opinions we may have or others may have, or desires that we have that push us in certain directions without reflection or sitting with that consultation with that deep mystery. So this is called the nafs al-amara, the commanding self. And then that moment of reflection begins to open when we find a turning happening in our hearts, when we're turned back to that source from which we are breathed. And this is the nafs al-lawama, the repentant self that is turned again to its source. And then the inspired self, the nafs al-muhime, the self that opens to that inspiration from our source, to that intimacy that begins to open within the heart. And then we're brought into the aspect of the self that's called the tranquil or satisfied self, the nafs al-mutmaina, the heart that is at rest, because as it's said in the Quran, truly in the remembrance of God, hearts find rest. And then the journey moves into that self, that aspect of self that is pleasing pleased with God and pleasing to God, the nafs al-radiyah and mardiyah, and then the purified self, or the purified heart that then can open fully to that listening, that communication with that mystery, and diving deeply into the heart, where that intimate relationship can open.
The journey of the self, as it's the map of the stages the self can pass through on the spiritual journey, from at the lowest levels just being prisoners of our own egoism, our own addictions, our own, emotional reactions and judgments and fears, to the stage where we begin to repent of all this, and then to the stage actually of, there are 7 stages, and the 3rd stage is something close to what would be called salvation in religious terms. Of the 7 stages, only the 3rd is salvation, when the good has basically prevailed over the negative in us. But beyond that is another stage. And this is where I think it gets interesting. And I think it's a stage that humanity is coming to now. More people in the human race are beginning to come to the threshold of a new level of consciousness. And this level of consciousness can be described by terms like mindfulness, or presence, or heartfulness. And this is where spiritual practice, contemplative practice, where the so-called spiritual paths of different traditions that are something above and beyond religion. Religion is a belief system, a moral system, sometimes a system of sacraments and ceremonies. It's all good, it can be all good. But there's another level that enters here, where a human being begins to become conscious. Conscious in the sense of really having a perspective on your own self. Something that can, in a sense, step back and really notice what's going on. What is my self doing? What is it thinking? What's governing my actions now? You develop a deeper relationship with your own motivations. You enter a different dimension of self-knowledge. And this depends on a quality of consciousness, a quality of presence that doesn't come automatically for human beings. At least not in this age, in this society, where human beings are so automatized, so habitual, so kind of reactive and mechanical, typically. So there are practices to develop this kind of presence or heartfulness. Meditative, contemplative practices that basically have to do with stilling the thoughts, quieting the emotions, and entering a dimension of yourself that can stand back from your thinking and your feelings, your likes and dislikes. And with a practice like meditation or contemplation, and it doesn't have to be just sitting still in one place like a monk or a yogi, you can actually attain this state in running, in cross-country skiing, in walking. If you know how to do it, it can be discovered and developed in active states, although it may at first be more approachable by sitting still, watching your breath, and taking a step back into the silence as we did at the very beginning. But that silence we step into is not just a silencing of the spoken word. It's also a silencing of the mind, quieting of our inner thoughts, which, though difficult, is not impossible, and in fact can be cultivated over time and become more your natural state. The beauty of this state is that as we develop, let's call it a presence that is somehow above or outside of our usual thinking and feeling, it brings a spaciousness that allows us to observe our thoughts, to even think more clearly, to formulate intentions, to see how there are aspects of our lower self that disturb us, that even torment us. The human being who, without this kind of inner spaciousness, can be the victim of their own thoughts, their own resentments, their own disappointments, their own fears. I've noticed that in just introducing this to people, that there are quite a few people who really fear just being quiet. Fear really going inside. Because what they find there is to some extent out of their control. Thoughts that you don't know where they're coming from. Some of them are just habitual old recordings that keep playing themselves again and again. It could be low-level resentments for things we have in life, for people, for relationships, for circumstances. And how will the human being attain freedom from that and find a place within ourselves that is not subject to that kind of inner slavery? This is where what has been called mysticism, or the contemplative life, or spiritual practice, can be seen as something absolutely essential for our human well-being, and not just a specialization for some weird people who might be monks, or yogis, or mystics, but human beings who are developing their full human capacities and awakening a part of ourselves that will bring us some inner freedom, some ability to even, shall we say, transform character. You know, religions have been preaching forever and ever. Be good, don't be bad. If that doesn't work, though, then you scare people. Talk about hell and things like that. How well has it worked? But the transformation of the human being from an ego to a soul, from a limited false self, which is governed by fear, by perhaps ambition, selfishness on the one hand, or on the other hand, a lack of self-esteem, neurotic shame and guilt. The false self is governed by vanity, pride, resentment, envy, is in fact a false self. It's not who you are. It's not what the divine created you to be. Maybe the divine created us to be in that relationship with the infinite, in a relationship with the source of love within our own being. So, just one second. I just want to reiterate, Sufism, the tradition we come from, I hope you're not disappointed that I'm not telling you all of the cultural, esoteric aspects. I could do that. If you ask me, I will. But I didn't really come here for a sectarian purpose, to convince you that one way is better than another way. That's not what my path has taught me. Yes, we do have a path that has its own culture, it has its own music, its own poetry, its own customs. But it leads to universality, it leads to a kind of transparency. and openness. And it really is not a specialization for some rare, strange sort of person who just happens to have as a hobby, fantasizing about the supernatural. No. It's about how do we grow as human beings? How do we use our human consciousness? How do we train our attention so that we can keep our attention on the mystery and let that mystery transform us? Because we believe just by directing our attention toward the divine in an open way, as Matthew showed us, in the silence and stillness of your own heart, you simply turn your soul toward that source, and you let that source work upon you, because so much is coming from that direction, more than we could ever do for ourselves in the way of our own efforts to reform ourselves or to change our character. So much more comes to us from the infinite divine mystery if we can simply, truly, sincerely orient our souls in silence and stillness towards the divine. So let's pause a little bit for some dialogue. What's on your minds? What's in your hearts? What would you like to talk about? What touched you so far? And what confused you? Yes.
I don't know whether it's appropriate right now or not. Maybe you do it later or now. I was very touched by your showing us Saturday how to do the prayer, the bowing, and the prostration. I think we could all profit from that. And your explanation of it was so helpful to understand the depth of it.
Yeah. Good.
So,
We
before you leave.
Yeah, sure. Good. Yeah, we haven't really talked about Islam and what Islam is about. And there's so much misunderstanding in today's world, through the media, through the problems that have arisen in the world, some of the reactions to those problems in the name of religion that are ultimately great distortions of religion, and each of our traditions has those distortions and those crimes. But the important thing, I would say, are those crimes and criminals, can they be justified in terms of the religion they claim to represent? One thing about Islam is that, it doesn't have a centralized authority. It doesn't have a pope. It doesn't have a dogma as such. What it has is the Quran, which is a reference point in the way that the Constitution of the United States is a reference point for our democracy. The Quran is a reference point for Muslims. You can always point back to it and say, well, is something justified in terms of the Quran? Of course, there's always elements of interpretation that also enter, and misinterpretation as well. But let me just share with you a few, I think, important statements from the Quran. I'm going to quote it in what I believe are absolutely, reliable translations without any distortion or taking any liberties. Whatever voice spoke in the Quran, a voice that spoke to Muhammad, Muhammad, didn't write the Quran. He received it through inspiration, and it came out of him as a very beautiful language, a poetic language that was inimitable, and at the time people would just fall down and weep when they heard it, because they'd never heard anything quite like it before. And it was so much of it was about the mercy and beauty of the divine and the nurturance of the divine for humanity. So the Quran says, we could have created you. God speaks as this we. We could have created you as one people, but we created you as different nations and tribes and peoples in order that you might know one another and in order that you might compete in virtue with each other. So it didn't claim a monopoly for any one community. All communities can strive in things that are virtuous and just. And Quran also says, and of all the disputes that happen on earth among these different communities and religions, God will show you the truth in the end. You could say, in eternity, the truth about the matters in which you differed. And it also says, whether you are Christian, Jewish, Sabian, that was a group in the Middle East at that time, or Muslim, if you do the good and keep faith, you will have nothing to fear from God, nor shall you grieve. Neither fear nor grief. So that extends to all religious communities. It also says, let there be no compulsion in religion. Let there be no compulsion in religion. So just as an article of Islamic law, forced conversions were never considered legitimate. If ever there was a political power that demanded that people convert, their conversions could not be even accepted in the eyes of God. So this was not traditionally part of Islamic practice. And there was just a lot of emphasis on the idea of remembrance of God and purifying the heart. Hearts that become numbed, hearts that become hardened, hearts that even become diseased, need to be, in a sense, renovated, reawakened, purified, because it's with the heart that the human being knows what is most important to know, because the heart is not just the seat of emotions. It's not primarily the seat of emotions. The heart is a way of knowing. The heart is that through which we know relationship, and that through which we know the qualities of this universe we live in. Quantum physics, cutting-edge physics today is getting to some very interesting places. Sometimes the physicists sound almost like mystics when they describe the nature of reality. It gets pretty strange and interesting. But whatever physicists may say about the nature of this reality, they are still speaking about a quantitative reality, a measurable reality, and not about a qualitative reality, which the heart knows. What do I mean by that? To be really specific, to know, to have a sense of your own mortal existence, to be humble before the infinite, to love being itself, to love just the fact that we are, that we exist, to feel tenderness for other human beings. All the things we most value are invisible. Friendship, love, forgiveness. The most precious things in this life are invisible and not measurable. Even if they could be measured to some extent in our brain waves, That doesn't measure the qualitative nature of what's going on. Yes, we can measure the meditative state. We can show that a person who is developed, a contemplative that has developed themselves, has a very different, shall we say, electrical pattern in the brain. So you can look at it and say, oh, well, that looks really different than a criminal. You can see the difference, and we have the instruments. But still, it doesn't put you inside the subjective experience, the qualitative experience of that human being. This is what the heart does. This is what the heart is for. So the most important education is the education of the heart. Minds should also be educated. Bodies should be educated. But it's nearly meaningless without the education of the heart. It's not being done very well in our society. What would such an education look like? Yes, Matthew?
I'd like to speak to that a little bit. My background, I started with philosophy, and then the study of religion came for one reason, was that philosophy was only the language was only seeming to orient itself to a particular part of my person, a particular part of my being. And there was something about religious language that seemed to incorporate a deeper aspect, a more heartful aspect into its knowledge and into its understanding. I think Sufism has done a wonderful job at, it's poetic by nature. The wisdom that it's trying to convey seems to be poetic by nature, in the fact that you cannot come to this knowledge until you have somehow integrated what we might call the intellect with what we might call the heart.
Yeah.
They need to be seamlessly integrated, and the wisdom and the integration are not two separate things. The wisdom and the integration are one, and I think poetry and the religious language of seers, the Prophet Muhammad and Jesus, resonate with a kind of qualitative energy that I don't think anything, for my purposes anyway, nothing I found resonates at that level than what I find in especially the mystical traditions of religion. That's the language that seems to hit upon all these centers at once.
Yes.
In reflecting with that, there's a beautiful short passage from Rumi that also would connect into the demonstration of the prayer. In a short moment in his great work of the Masnavi, he wrote 6 volumes. Well, he spoke them, and they were written down by his close friend near him, 26,000 couplets. There's this little moment that comes, and he says, "Listen, O drop, give yourself up without regret, and in exchange, gain the ocean. Listen, O drop, bestow upon yourself this honor, and in the arms of the sea be secure. Who indeed could be so fortunate, an ocean wooing a drop? In God's name, sell and buy at once. Give a drop and take this sea full of pearls."
So this capacity that we're talking about, this poetic language, which by saying one thing means another. Metaphor takes us to that imaginative realm that also touches the heart. And eventually, too, it reshapes our perception, so we actually begin to live more and more in that qualitative reality, which is merciful, generous, beautiful, to be trusted. That takes away fear, resentment, many forms of negativity. As a person becomes truly a person of faith, not a person of belief. I mean, you can believe in anything you want. You can believe that everything in existence is governed by the giant purple armadillo if you want. But it's not going to save your soul. What's going to save the soul is a perception of spiritual reality. The heart's knowledge that we live within a meaningful, intelligent, gracious existence. And we've been brought here in order to experience the true generosity and guidance of the divine. When we know that, the extent to which we know that, our sense of being in this world changes. It doesn't exempt us from suffering, nor do we make escaping suffering the purpose of our lives. We can accept everything within that context. And we know we live in love's universe, and we know that everything is, in a sense, designed for the education of our souls. Then we accept what happens in every moment. We embrace it. We say, praise be to God for whatever comes our way. And you know, nowadays we have scientific evidence to show the exquisite intelligence that's operating at every level of existence, from the microcosmic to the macrocosmic. But just say focus on molecular biology and you know, the way things are shaped and how intelligent they are, and how it all works together with such exquisite perfection. And we witness that in physical reality. But somehow we don't get that the invisible spiritual reality is just as exquisitely organized as the physical. Why should the physical be so obviously intelligent and governed by intelligence? And by the way, I don't know if this is a controversial statement, but the Darwinian concept of evolution is being pretty much discarded. Programmers know that the programming of evolution could not have happened randomly. Yes, there is evolution. We're not creationists. We don't believe the world was created 6,000 years ago. But all the evidence is now showing that some kind of intelligence is operating in our DNA, and that there's not enough time in all of the existence of this earth to evolve a worm by random mutation, let alone a human being and the exquisite reality that is DNA. So there's intelligence operating at every level of existence. Why would there not be an intelligent grace and guidance operating invisibly to educate our hearts and souls? Someday, Matthew, just as an experiment in one of your classes, ask your students if any of them have ever experienced anything in their lives that doesn't fit the normal scientific paradigm. Things that can't be explained. Things of a slightly miraculous, or if you like, coincidental nature. And see what you come up with. See what people actually bring forth. People will tell you stories that they've never told anybody before, very likely. Because people would think, you're crazy. I'll tell you one little story that happened in the publishing world. Just as one, I could give 100 examples, but this is a kind of a cute one. So we used to be publishers, and in the early days, when we put together a book, we had to get the type, and we had to glue the type onto, pages to give to the printer. Some of you remember what that was like. And so we were doing a book of Rumi, and it was actually a book by Coleman Barks, who's a very well-known Rumi translator. And the book came out, it was published, it went out to the distributor and bookstores. And 2 weeks later, there's a message on my phone machine, and it's from Coleman Barks, the translator. And he says, I'm listening to it, he says, Kabir, did you see it? The mistake, I mean? He said, take a look at pages, 68 through 71. So I looked and I saw that what had happened was that there were 2 poems, each of them should have been 2 pages long. The stanzas look similar. And Rumi is pretty mystical, it's all pretty far out. It's sometimes people read it, they don't understand it. And it's all good anyway, it all kind of works together. But what had happened was that instead of being 69, 70, 71, 72, the page numbers were right, but the poems were actually 69, 71, 70, 72, if you can see what I mean. So
The second halves got switched.
so the second page of each poem was switched. So it was, an understandable mistake. If you were just to look at it, you wouldn't notice it unless you read the poems very carefully and understood them. Then you would know that, no, this part doesn't go with that part. But now I'm getting to the interesting part. Because exactly the line that was broken on the page, the poem that was broken, one page ends, you have bought damaged goods. And then the next line that was like at the top on the next page that should have followed it, it was, but now you see what they are. So, it was Rumi having a little joke, at our expense, laughing, in the unseen, as we struggled and went frantic, and how are we going to get the word out to our distributors that the pages are all mixed up and so forth. So life is full of synchronicities like this. And I think the synchronicities are actually increasing. I don't know why, but they
Which
are.
one of the Rumi books is that?
It was called,
This longing.
it's called This Longing.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have
We
that.
published
was one of the
Coleman's
early-
first 4 books,
Oh.
and this was, I think, the third of those 4.
Yeah.
Oh, so what we did to correct it, there was a stamp, a very famous stamp that was also a misprint, and it's worth
A postage stamp.
tens of thousands of dollars now, where a plane was reversed, the plane was upside down on the stamp, the currency was right, but the plane was upside down. So I found an image of that stamp, and I created a little sticker that had that stamp with the upside down plane, and then I described what had happened and what the true sequence of pages ought to be, and sent it to our distributor and had him put this stamp, on the relevant page of every book, so it could be correct.
To straighten it out.
I just want to share a synchronicity moment.
Yeah.
Please.
I teach Intro to Theology. I just got out of class, and I'm showing Tom Shadyack's film called I Am.
Yes. I know.
And, what you're saying is it just exactly had Coleman Barks and quoting Rumi, and I said, and here you guys are. I mean,
Yeah.
who could have planned this? It's lovely.
Sweet.
So I think the lesson to be taken from this is that the conventional, remember the poem Rumi gave us, conventional opinion is the ruin of our souls. If you believe only in the scientific, logical reality that works most of the time, and it's good for certain things, but it doesn't
and
explain...
it's a wonderful witnessing, too, which we're encouraged with the Quran and other holy books to witness this amazing creation and how it works, and these beautiful beings of all the different communities of creation.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's more going on, and we begin to discern a kind of intelligence operating beyond appearances. And we learn to trust that. That's the miraculous, that's the mysterious. It's a very real part of life. And religions that get too rationalistic, too too logical or that dwell only at that level are in fact cutting themselves off from a very important dimension of the real. We have a few more minutes. Any other thoughts or questions before? I was asked to demonstrate the Islamic ritual prayer and explain it, and we have some minutes left for that, unless you want to ask or comment on anything else.
Well, I loved your image of with the ocean, and I always say that God's love and mercy are an ocean so broad that it has no shore, and so deep that it has no depth. And I think that was very much what you
Yes,
were.
exactly.
Beautiful.
An ocean without shore.
Yeah.
So let me explain what's going on with the ritual prayer of Islam. You know, it's meant to be, a Muslim is encouraged, ideally, to pray 5 times a day. And the ritual prayer, when you're doing it alone, may only take 5 minutes. In congregation, sometimes they extend it, takes maybe 10 minutes. But, so it's a very brief exercise of both physical postures combined with heartfulness, mindfulness, full-on attention. The significance of its timeliness is that, for one thing, it orients us, it wakes us up in that and the time is decided based on sunrise and sunset. It's not like 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock. It begins at the first light of dawn, not sunrise, but at the first light of dawn, and then just past noon, and then mid-afternoon, and then just past sunset, and then in the first dark of night, usually an hour or so after sunset. So those are the 5 times of prayer. Muslim astronomers from the earliest days calculated the times of prayer for different geographic locations, and nowadays people even have you can have it on your iPhone, a reminder that it's time to pray, and it depends on where you are, and so you program in your coordinates, and you'll be reminded when it's time to pray. But the significance of the timeliness is one significance, besides the fact that it wakes us up to time and the need to be sort of alert within time, is that people all over the world who are doing the ritual prayer in a timely fashion, and technically you're given a window of, there's an exact time, but knowing that God is merciful and beneficent, you have a certain window in which to operate. But if you were in, let's say, Turkey, you would hear the call to prayer. Let's say you're on a mountaintop above a big city, which I've often experienced, and you'll begin to hear the mosques calling out the prayer. And if it's a big enough city, you'll actually begin to see it slowly move across the city, one by one. People
So
are that
beautiful.
precise with it. So what's going on is that there are 5 waves of prayer circling the planet, and people standing, bowing, and prostrating, and all of them oriented towards Mecca. What's in Mecca? An empty cube. Just an empty cube. And everybody knows it's empty. If you were to place yourself in the center of that cube, you would be at the point where these 5 waves of humanity would all be, in a sense, bowing to each other.
Through the doorway to the infinite.
Yeah. So what Muslims are doing is they're reciting a prayer that the translation of which is this: God is greater than anything in existence. In the name of God, the infinitely compassionate and infinitely merciful, all praise is God's. The Lord of all worlds, the infinitely compassionate and merciful, ruler on the day of recognition. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we ask for help. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those who have received your grace, not the path of those who have brought suffering upon themselves, nor of those who wander astray. Amen. Glory be to God, glory be to God, glory be to God. And then, glory be to God in the highest, glory be to God in the highest, glory be to God in the highest. That's the Muslim prayer. That's what people are reciting. They're not even naming a religion. They're not praying to any human being. They're just face to face with the infinite. They're honoring that with all of their attention, and they're stopping the momentum of their day to pause in that stillness and with complete presence to give their full attention to the divine. That's what they're doing. So I was asked by Sister Mary just to demonstrate this, and I'll ask Camille to do the call to prayer, as if she were on top of a minaret somewhere, and then I will let you see what the prayer looks like.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, hayya ala falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illa Allah.
Allahu Akbar. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi 'alayhim waladdallin. Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil Azim. Sami Allahu liman hamidah. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So that was one cycle of prayer. Typically there would be 4 or 8. We just did one to shorten the time a little bit for you. But I'll tell you an interesting story. There was a time when Camille and I were doing an Enneagram retreat with Helen Palmer, who is one of the big Enneagram authors, and she would invite us to come and do the heart teachings while she did what she called the head teachings of the Enneagram. And it was a week week-long event at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And each day we would offer some practices. They were all traditional Sufi practices, but we kind of left the Islamic labels behind a little bit. And one day I said to the group, would you like to experience some archetypal postures? And everybody said, oh yes, archetypal postures, that sounds really good. So I had there was about 80 people. They were, psychologists, and there were some corporate type people and clinicians and so forth. So we lined up women in rows and men in rows, and I explained these postures. The first one is, this is a meditative posture, which reminds us of our human dignity and responsibility. And there's a second meditative posture, which is the posture of servanthood. And then we return to that posture of human responsibility, and then we go into the prostration, which is surrender, and then we come back to kneeling to regather ourselves, and then there's the surrender of surrender, the effacement of effacement, the complete dissolving in the divine, which is the second prostration. And people said, people loved it. Most of these people never in their lives touched their forehead to the ground, guaranteed. And people were saying, Kabir, this is what the corporate world needs. Can we do this on our own? So anyway, but I also showed it wasn't here, but if you want to read in the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah, remember, book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, you will see the prophet or the scribe, Ezra, leading, first of all, calling people from a large high tower, glorifying God, and then they name all the people standing in a row with him, and they raise their hands, they glorify God, and then they prostrated and touched their heads to the ground. And then Nehemiah describes that the people were weeping as they listened to the Torah. And then they were told, this is a day of joy. Go, eat, and be happy in the Lord. So this kind of worship is not something new. It's not something invented by Muhammad and by Muslims. It goes right back through the whole Abrahamic tradition. Even Jesus talks about it in the Garden of Gethsemane. The night before his crucifixion. No, in the Garden of Gethsemane, of course, when he fell upon his face and prayed. So these are archetypal postures. And the essence of it is just worship of the divine. So thank you all for coming. And
well, let me sort of say that, Saint Dominic had 9 ways of prayer. Is it 7 or 9? 9. And each is a different posture like that, including one lying down. And of course, in our own Catholic tradition, with chanting office and so forth, we've used those. I had the experience once. I made a yoga retreat with Swami Satchidananda once. Don't know if he's still alive, but I doubt it. But no, he couldn't be. And no, he'd be too old. But the people who were there, who were his followers, when they would see him, they would bow to him. And I said, well, he's a human being like that. Am I going to, would I consider that I should bow to him also? But I said, he's a holy man, and I respected that, so I began to do that. And then it occurred to me how when we say our chant, our office, we had 3 kinds of inclinations. There was a head inclination, and then there's a medium inclination, and then there's a profound one where your hands go here. And we did that here day after day, 3 or 4 times a day. It's something similar to this. But, after a while, when you were young and they taught you this, then all of a sudden you say, now a head inclination is this. A medium inclination, I gotta put my elbows down here. A profound one, I gotta put my hands here. And you get caught up in the
Form.
of
the
it.
form, and you don't think about it. But that session with that retreat with the Swami, who was a Hindu, brought it back very clearly to me after that. And after that, I never genuflected, which is what the Catholics do, but some of us, well, I was younger then, but anyway. But now I always bow rather than genuflect, because so just thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you.
I just think your explanation of it, the prayer, you know, you said it in your own language, but
It really, it never occurred to me when I was there. I was thinking, well, of course, it's not a woman doing it, it's a man, but it was very powerful, so powerful to hear it at these intervals, like the Buddhist gong or something, to remember to stop and be mindful. But that was lovely to have a woman's voice. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Yes, Anne?
I just have a request. It was very touching to be in communion with everyone singing the song. Could we do the next one?
Yeah, the other one? Sure, if you like.
Sure.
And I'll tell you a story about the other one. There's a wonderful priest, trying to remember his name, Cyprian. Father Cyprian, who tours the world singing this second song that we're going to sing, even with the La ilaha illallah.
He's in the new Kamaldana's.
And he sees a sort of Eucharistic overtones in this particular song. It's the one that's called The Drink Sent Down. And there's a chant in this Alhamdulillah, which means praise be to God. And there's also La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but God. So
Or no reality, but the reality.
we should get closer to this. Huh?
Yep.
And you take advantage of it. Get your voice close enough to it so we hear you.
I mean, it seems like there's a short in the mic, so it might, is it like sometimes it's on, sometimes, yeah, there we go. It should be good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or should
I
we
don't know if
switch?
Camille's
Should we
standing.
switch?
I don't know what it is, but sometimes it goes off and sometimes it comes back on. Okay, you're good right now, so as long
We'll go.
Camille doesn't move her foot, it's great.
La
Sometimes we add in Yahai, Yahai, ever living.